We had decided to invite the co-authors of the book, The Singular Universe and the Reality of Time, to discuss very big cosmic themes. But then we realized one of the authors had just been appointed to the cabinet in the government of Brazil. And because in Brazil, 1 million people protested against corruption and economic mismanagement across that country last weekend, we thought we'd start with that before moving on to cosmology and physics. And so, with that, we welcome in Brasilia, Brazil, via Skype, Roberto M. Unger. He is professor of law at Harvard University when he is not serving as Brazil's Minister of Strategic Affairs. Mr. Unger, we welcome you back to TVO. We remind everybody you were here about 4 years ago at a time when Brazil was really firing on all cylinders. And now you have your old job back. So let's start there. What does the Minister for Strategic Affairs do?
My task is to help coordinate public policy and to propose a direction for the government and for the country. We are now in the midst of a transition in our development strategy. For the last couple of decades, we have had a strategy of economic growth based largely on the production and export of commodities and on the popularization of consumption. It's been a democratizing of the economy on the demand side that has lifted millions of Brazilians out of poverty. But now we've come to the end, to the limit of this strategy of growth, and we need to develop a new approach, an approach based on democratizing access to production and education, a democratizing of the economy on the supply side rather than on the demand side. You can democratize the economy on the demand side just with money, but to democratize the economy on the supply side, you need institutional innovation. It's a much harder task.
Let me just share with our viewers what you know all too well, which is this transition is coming with some pain these days. For example, the Brazilian currency has hit a 12-year low in relationship to the U.S. dollar. The economy expected to shrink 0.6% this year. Last year, manufacturing employment fell by 3.2%, inflation running above 7%. There is the possibility that water and power rationing will take place because the drought is very widespread. And there's, as we saw on the weekend, with millions of people in the streets, a great deal of public anger over corruption involving Brazilian politicians and the state-owned oil giant Petrobras. Let me get a sense from you as to how you would characterize the state of the economy today.
I would say that our fundamentals are solid. Debt ratios in Brazil are low, but it is also true that we can't continue to advance by the same means that we have used in the recent past. There are two great forces that are fueling national discontent. One of them is that as millions of people came up out of poverty and had access to mass consumption goods, they came to demand, as they should demand, high-quality public services of health, education, and public security. And this imbalance between more income, more consumption on the one hand, and inadequate public services on the other, is one of the chief causes of the present national discontent. But a second cause is that we have stopped growing enough, and we've stopped growing enough because conditions both in the world and in the Brazilian economy have changed. We now need to do something much harder than what we've done in the past. There's tremendous vitality in Brazilian society. Millions of people have come from below. There are millions of small-scale business people in Brazil, tremendous entrepreneurial and cultural energy. But much of this energy is wasted for lack of equipment and opportunity. What we need to do now is to give instruments to our people. These two large causes are aggravated by a third element that has been paramount in the recent protests, and those are the corruption problems. We face the need radically to change our system for the financing of politics, of electoral finance. That has been the gateway to corruption in Brazilian politics, the dependence of the political class on financing from big corporations. We have to change all of that.
I'm tempted to say one has to be impressed with a politician, and I'm not talking about you here, I'm talking about another one you'll recognize, whose slogan is, yes, I'm corrupt, but I'm hands-on. How does Brazil manage to get away with that kind of politics?
Well, actually, contrary to what many people believe, Brazil is far from being the most corrupt of the middle-income countries. If we compare Brazil to the other so-called BRIC countries, Russia, China, and India, I think all students of comparative politics would agree that the problem of corruption is much more severe in those other three countries. We do have corruption problems, but these problems are mainly focused, they're localized in the relation of politics to big money, and specifically in the financing of political activity. It is a problem that we can solve. Our deeper problems lie in this contrast between the energy of the Brazilian people and the denial to them of adequate educational and economic equipment.
How impressed were you with the size and the scope of the protests from last weekend?
I think it's very encouraging that we have a civil society that is so vibrant and so determined to demand a change of course in the country. The risk is that all of this discontent will come and go as a wave and not leave an institutional legacy. My concern is to be sure that we use this opportunity to change our institutions, to democratize the market economy, and to deepen democracy in Brazil. It's not enough to regulate the market. It's not enough to attenuate inequalities generated in the market by compensatory redistribution. What we need to do is actually to democratize the market economy, to give more people more access to more markets in more ways. And that requires invention, innovation, renewal of our institutional arrangements.
Well, let me just ask you a bit about fear. Is there a part of you that is afraid that if those million people who came out into the streets in, I think, a few dozen different cities in Brazil decide to turn on you and your government, my goodness, what could come next? Do you worry about that?
Action never frightens me. What frightens me is passivity.
Okay, fair enough. Let me ask you about if there's anything peculiarly Brazilian about Brazilian democracy.
We have a rough and tumble democracy. Brazil is the country in the world that is most like the United States. It's a country of almost identical size, based, as the United States is, on European settlement and African slavery, a very religious country with immense diversity, and a country of tremendous inequalities. As the United States is the most unequal of the rich industrial democracies, we are the most unequal of the large developing societies. And yet, paradoxically, in the midst of these vast inequalities, in the United States and in Brazil, the majority of ordinary men and women continue to believe that everything is possible. There is another respect, however, in which we are very unlike the United States. The Americans have traditionally believed that they are the discoverers of the definitive formula of a free society, and that the rest of the world must either subscribe to their formula or continue to languish in poverty and despotism. We have suffered from the opposite vice of not believing in ourselves. And thus, our political institutions and our economic institutions are copied. They're like borrowed clothes. And that's not good enough anymore. We need to develop the economic institutions that can democratize access to the resources of production, and the political institutions that can create a high-energy democracy in Brazil, a democracy that no longer needs crisis to make change possible. That's what I want. I have devoted my public life in Brazil to arguing for a change of direction. The dominant idea in Brazilian politics has been a kind of sugarcoating. Everyone professes to be a social liberal or a social democrat. And what is the social? The social is the sugar to sweeten the pill of the economic regime. The Brazilian people no longer want sugar. They want action. They want instruments. They want opportunities. They want equipment. And that's the fundamental belief of a democrat. The central creed of democracy is faith in the constructive genius of ordinary men and women. The objective of progressives historically has been less to humanize society than it has been to divinize humanity.
I'd like to touch in our remaining few moments here before we talk about your book with Lee. I'd like to talk about a couple of more things, the first of which I think when all the eyes of the world were on Brazil, and it was last year, it was during the World Cup, the pride of the people was fantastic, being the hosts to the world. But then that final loss to Germany, which was so tough and so lopsided and presumably so humiliating from Brazil, I'm just wondering what effect all of that had on Brazilians' sense of confidence.
No effect, really. You asked before, what is peculiarly Brazilian about Brazilian democracy? I think there is immense resilience in Brazil. The most important attribute of our country is its vitality. A German poet once wrote that he who thinks most deeply loves what is most alive. By this criterion, Brazil is lovable. Our chief attribute is our lifelike character. And what I want now is to give instruments, arms, wings, and eyes to all of this life that seethes in our country.
The world was quite fixated a few years back on the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China. You mentioned earlier that you think Brazil is the least corrupt of all of them. Okay, what future do you see, what political future do you see for the BRIC nations?
They don't have a predetermined course now. The truth is that the whole world now is bent under the yoke of a dictatorship of no alternatives. In the rich North Atlantic countries, including Canada, the governing groups are focused on the attempt to combine European-style social protection with American-style economic flexibility within a very narrow range of institutional alternatives. And outside, in the rest of the world, including the BRIC countries, the only alternative that has emerged is a state capitalism, and often authoritarian state capitalism. That's not enough. Humanity wants something else. We must overthrow this dictatorship of no alternatives by democratizing the market and deepening democracy, by creating societies that are able to experiment. We need structural solutions, but unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, We can no longer believe in structural dogmas. What we therefore must do is to radicalize the experimentalist impulse in our societies, to create societies of permanent innovators, and to create institutions that facilitate their own reinvention. That's what the BRIC countries should do, must do. They must cast aside the temptation of authoritarian state capitalism and instead devote themselves to a course of radical democratic experimentalism. And that's what I will fight for in Brazil.
Understood.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.